Classic handheld Pokémon. A concept masterfully handled over 7 generations of titles before Game Freak eventually made the transition over to high-definition console adventures. Pokémon now has the freedom to transform into a true 3D, fully-fledged RPG. And we've seen some good games and signs of progression in the Switch era. And actually, even back on the GameCube, main series Pokémon is evolving. But nonetheless, those original generations are still the gift that keeps on giving. Somehow, despite being decades old, something about that handheld era is simply timeless. And us fans still want to re-experience them time and time again. But there's only one problem. Unless you already have the games, you're gonna need a spare kidney. Purchasing the old games and the hardware to play them on, if you don't have them already, is going to cost you a lot of money. And that's one big reason why a lot of people turn to ROMs and ROM hacks, which we'll get into later. But with some recent news emerging, and also with some critical thinking, I think it's a fair conclusion to arrive at that the classic games are coming to Switch systems sooner than you might think, and perhaps in cooler ways than you might think. So, in this video, we're going to explore why the classic Pokémon games aren't on the Switch yet, when we might expect to see them, and also how they might arrive. Let's start with the most recent piece of news that led us here. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team has just been announced for the Switch's GBA Virtual Console. The Switch currently has the Game Boy and Game Boy Color, the NES and SNES, the Sega Genesis, the Nintendo 64 and the Game Boy Advance as Virtual Console apps. And from time to time, they will release new classic games from those consoles, often after a Nintendo Direct, but also sometimes spontaneously. Pokémon Stadium and Stadium 2 have been sporadically announced as titles in fairly low-key Nintendo announcements back in 2023. And some other Pokémon spin-off games are available too, like Pokémon Snap, the trading card video game, etc. And recently, Mystery Dungeon was the latest to drop out of nowhere as the latest legacy Pokémon title to add to the list. For those who don't know, the original Mystery Dungeon titles were very popular games that initially launched as Red Rescue Team on the GBA and Blue Rescue Team on the DS, during a period where the DS was very new and not everyone owned one yet. I personally got Red Rescue Team as a Christmas present and I loved it. I had so much fun on that game, and I will definitely be playing this again on the Switch, possibly on stream, and it would be great to see you come and hang out whilst I play it as well, so subscribe and come check it out if you want to. I'm trying to hit 4,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so every click helps. But those original Mystery Dungeon games sold over 5 million copies collectively. Numbers that don't stray too far from main series Pokémon sales. So what does this mean for main series games? Well, technically, it would be possible that this is just a standalone announcement and it means nothing. But with handheld era main series Pokémon games selling over 227 million copies collectively, it would be borderline insanity to never have a plan to bring those classic titles to the Switch or its successor. And I see a lot of people extremely confused as to why they haven't done this yet. Well, in 2023, Nintendo discontinued new purchases from the 3DS eShop. Now, the 3DS was an extremely popular console, and not only can it play every DS and 3DS era title, it also sold the original Gen 1 and 2 games on its eShop as virtual console titles. You could download and relive these games with the ability to transfer any Pokémon captured in your save files to Pokémon Bank and then onto Pokémon Home, and from there onto any main series Pokémon Switch title. Being able to do that was very, very cool, and if you already have the games downloaded on your 3DS, you can still do this now. But around the time of the 3DS eShop closure announcement, this will have encouraged many Pokémon fans to scramble and purchase all the available classic titles for a reasonable price. So they had a legitimate copy of the classic games they wanted to own before they were no longer available to purchase. From memory, the 3DS eShop was selling copies of the Gen 1 and 2 games for around £12 here in the UK, which is around $15. So a massive price difference compared to the average hard copy you might pick up on eBay, at CEX, or at any high street game shop. Plus, there is no legitimate way of transferring your Gen 1 and 2 hard copy Pokémon to Gen 3 games and beyond. So this 3DS eShop option was a hugely popular and fun reason to relive those older games and be able to transfer and use those Pokémon in newer games. And so the key point here is that once those final purchases from the eShop were made by fans before it closed, Pokémon morally had to wait a reasonable amount of time before launching these titles on the Switch, so those who spent money on the 3DS eShop version didn't feel scammed out of their money. If Pokémon hadn't announced anything before the eShop closure, earned that spike in sales of those games, and then immediately made them available on Switch afterwards, that would have been very morally questionable, and bad PR would have followed. Now, it's worth pointing out that the Gen 3 games were never available on the 3DS, so technically those games could be re-released on the Switch Virtual Console at any point. But I think taking a break and recalibrating everything around the legacy handheld titles is probably the right move from Pokemon's perspective. This means the Pokemon Company have the power to release either all the games together or in some sort of cycle when they do eventually launch them on the Switch. So it gives them a lot of control from a marketing perspective. Essentially, it saves them drifting completely out of sync. Now, I think in early 2025, it will have been long enough since the closure of the 3DS eShop for people to enjoy all of these legacy games in a freshly marketed way, and it will no longer feel outrageous for them to be re-released on Switch systems. But now, we have some additional factors that may affect the date, and perhaps also the way these games might be re-released. Firstly, Nintendo have confirmed that the Switch successor is on the horizon, and it will be announced before the end of March 2025. So I think this gives us a reasonable time frame to consider. Secondly, Pokémon Day is around the same time, on the 27th of February every year, and these two dates might serve as our window to see the classic titles announced on the Switch, and this possibly depends on Nintendo. I think there is every likelihood that the Switch successor will still be a Switch system, like a Switch 2 or a Super Switch, and retaining that core Switch name and branding means they will probably also keep their virtual console apps and library they've built thus far, even on the successor system, rather than starting a whole new virtual console for the new system from scratch. It's still possible they might do things from scratch. The Wii built its own virtual console, as did the 3DS, and now the Switch is doing its own thing. But I really don't think the Switch successor will be a 100% new console concept without Switch in the title. The UI and core branding is so strong, and the Switch is the third best-selling console of all time, and still has time to surpass the DS and PS2. So I have a feeling that the Switch branding and everything they've built will be retained and backwards compatible, maybe being slightly visually tweaked and powered up to freshen things up. So depending on when exactly Nintendo decide to announce the new system, and whether it ends up being a part of that Switch branded family, could affect how Pokémon decide to release the classic games, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But we have one more issue. Pokemon Gen 1, 2 and 3, in theory, could be released right now, because we already have virtual console apps for the Game Boy Color and the Game Boy Advance. But from Gen 4, the main series games moved from the GBA to the DS for Gen 4 and 5, and to the 3DS for Gen 6 and 7. Now, depending on the physical features of the Switch successor and its controller, it's plausible we could get DS and 3DS apps, as well as hopefully GameCube and Wii apps as well for titles like Colosseum, XD Gale of Darkness, Pokepark and Battle Revolution. That's the dream, but there is a lot of liaising the Pokemon Company would have to do with Nintendo to make this happen, and Pokemon would essentially be restricted by whether or not there are plans at Nintendo for those apps to be developed, plus the timescale of them, and whether they're available on both the Switch and its successor. It wouldn't be straightforward either. The DS has dual screens, and the 3DS also has dual screens, plus that Switch to make the graphics 3D. So it would depend if Nintendo would want to retain those gimmicks on a virtual console, or if they just give us a ROM version of the games where you can do what you need to with button formats, which I think would be most people's preference. It works with Pokemon ROMs, so why not? Alternatively, Pokemon could just consider Gen 1, 2 and 3 as the classic titles, as we recently got Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl as a way to play Gen 4 on the Switch, Gen 6 is about to have some Legend service, and Gen 7 technically isn't that old yet, which would just leave Gen 5, which is heavily rumoured to have remakes in the next few years. But let's assume that's not the case. The only difficulty is from Nintendo's perspective. they have to worry about more than just Pokémon games. There are a lot of popular DS and 3DS titles that rely way more heavily on the dual screen and 3D features. 3D is probably easier to get around because it's really just a visual luxury feature. You can play pretty much all games without it. But the dual screens are a bit trickier. The Switch system is touchscreen, so there are ways to get a similar experience in handheld mode, I suppose, but again, it all depends on what the Switch successor's physical layout is like. And crucially, it's contingent on whether Pokémon want to be beholden to Nintendo's Virtual Console apps. Which brings us to our next option. A remastered classics game, released as a new game for the Switch or its successor. This would give Game Freak and the Pokémon company themselves way more control over the execution of the product. And it would open up a big revenue opportunity as well, one that's not bottlenecked by whatever deal the devs strike with Nintendo to host the Pokémon games on the Virtual Console apps. And not only this, it would also enable them to make quality of life changes to the games. Whether they're visual refinements, custom rule sets, speedrun modes, randomizers, adding new Pokémon to older games, Easter eggs, the list goes on. Pokémon fans, again, particularly ones who have been around for a while, love the difficulty settings and customization options in ROM hacks. They are so popular. Radical Red probably being the pinnacle of them right now, but there are so many great ones out there that have enhanced and prolonged the popularity of the legacy games. And so this could be the perfect approach, enabling us to transfer our Pokémon to Pokémon Home directly as well, and perhaps even using our own Pokémon rather than rentals in Stadium and Stadium 2. Pokémon itself is arguably bigger than Nintendo, with its TCG, anime and merch side hustles it's got going on. And yes, I'm going to say it again, it is the highest grossing intellectual property in the world. So there's no real reason for them to wait around for Nintendo themselves to develop and release all the functioning apps required. We've seen Pokémon reimagine old classics like Mystery Dungeon DX and New Pokémon Snap, one being essentially a remaster in a new graphic style, and the other one being a reimagining of a beloved Nintendo 64 title, but with the ability to include new Pokémon to reflect the modern Pokédex. So when the Pokémon games come, there's every likelihood they will not only be re-released, but they will also be remastered, as the potential of doing this is vast and would be so popular. It stands to be decided whether Pokémon would want to retrospectively visit and edit the experience of their legendary legacy titles, but as long as it's still an option to play each game in that classic way, I think it makes so much sense commercially. And really, the Pokémon company would be missing a trick if they didn't give us some sort of customization options. For now, nothing is confirmed, but in my view, the market, with the popularity of ROM hacks and randomizers over the last few years, is perfect for a remaster of all the classic games, but with a legitimate way to play randomized and customized rule sets if you want to. There would still be restrictions to this compared to ROM hacks, like, for example, they would definitely not allow you to transfer Pokémon from any fully randomized saves through to Pokémon Home, because it would just make it way too easy to get legendaries and mythicals, for example. But I don't think people would really mind those restrictions being in place for the customized ways of playing, and the rewards for everybody involved would far outweigh any concerns in my view. But it all depends whether Pokémon have the courage to do this. For now, it's Legend ZA on the horizon, but on Pokémon Day 2025, if the future of the Nintendo Switch's successor is clear, don't be surprised if we see a classics game announced in some form. After all, it started with those iconic handheld games, and sometimes it's just so nice to re-experience Pokémon in that beautiful, top-down handheld way. Whether it's the unmatchable, iconic nostalgia of Gen 1 and 2, the magnificent strides forwards and technical improvements of Gen 3, saving the world from unstoppable droughts or torrential rains, and experiencing the expanded ultimate version of Kanto to date. The high stakes and lore expanding world of Gen 4, and those beautifully executed Johto remakes. The completeness of Gen 5 with its masterfully crafted story and atmosphere, or even the handheld 3D transition of the franchise into exciting new concepts like Mega Evolution, Island Trials and Z-Moves. But let me know what you think about all of this down in the comments. And until next time, love you gang.